Nate's hands were so numb he couldn't tell whether the shaft biting his palms was the old hay fork or just the ache of hunger sawing across his stomach. March on Stone Creek Pass offered no promise of thaw. The sun hung behind bruised clouds like a coin pinned to dirty muslin, and whenever the wind clawed down the draw, it burned his cheeks with needles of grit, sharp snow. High above him, the timberline looked like a torn pocket, spilling black scrap against a pewter sky, and somewhere farther up the ridge, a raven croaked at the cold. Between those ridges, a single stock shed leaned south, half snatched from its moorings, when last winter's blizzard shouldered through. Boards gaped, nails groaned, but it still stood, and that was enough. Inside, Nate Morgan, 22, rail-thin hair, the color of coal smoke eyes gone. The dull blue of river ice moved with the deliberate quiet of someone folding borrowed linens. His oilskin coat had been patched so often it looked quilted. The toes of his boots were stitched shut with baling twine. Every time he flexed his fingers, the cracked skin wept, so he wrapped them in burlap strips scavenged from feed bags. Nothing in that shed belonged to him, not the battered grain scoop, not the hay smelling faintly of summer grass, certainly not the cattle crowding the slats, steam wreathing their muzzles. Yet for 7 dawns running, he had treated them better than their absent owner, shoveling manure, mending a splintered rail, thawing the pump, so clean water would flow. He worked wordlessly, not for gratitude, but so no one could name him thief. Because this was not Nate's ranch, and those horses and cows and stubborn goats were not his burden. But each dusk he packed a flour sack with eggs, a bottle of milk, a nub of salt pork, and slipped into the white-barked aspens where the snow kept secrets. Down the hidden trail, his sisters waited Mia, six-piper, 4 cheeks hollow, ribcage sharp as saw teeth. One more night, he told himself, one more night with something warm in their bellies, and then he would think of tomorrow. "I'm not stealing," he whispered into the wool, muffling his mouth as the wind rose. "I'm working for food. That's fair." The shed had started as a chance, but after a week, it had hardened into a kind of covenant. With every chore finished, Nate convinced himself he was settling a ledger kept by no one but the mountain. Each scoop of grain repaid in breath, each stall swept a small down payment on tomorrow. What the balance might look like, he couldn't yet imagine. Perhaps a spring dawn, when Mia's cough would quiet, or the day Piper asked for seconds without glancing at him first. Until then, he counted his debts in footprints, splinters, and the brittle crack of ice under his boots, praying the past would keep his secret. Outside, snow crystals drifted through the loft's broken eaves, like ash shaking from an unseen hearth. They gathered on the back of his neck and melted down his spine, reminding him that winter still claimed these hills. He pictured the distant homestead, the big white house with the green roof where smoke uncurled into the sky whenever the wind lay down, and wondered if the owners would call him a sinner or a godsend if they ever learned the truth. Somewhere between this shed and that house lay the boundary between need and theft, and every night he stepped across it with his heart knocking like a loose board. He didn't know their names. The people who lived in the big white farmhouse with the green roof, he only knew they came and went. Sometimes they'd be gone for days. Other times he saw a lantern flicker at night when he peeked from the ridge above. Once he caught sight of her. The woman, she was out hanging linens in the biting wind, her long dark skirt whipping around her boots. She looked tired. Not angry, just tired. He'd seen that look before, worn it himself. On the day everything changed, the boy was late getting back to the barn. The littlest one had cried all morning with a cough that rattled her chest like a paper bag caught in a fence. He almost didn't go at all, but they needed the milk, and he was afraid if he skipped even one day the animals would get sick, or worse, someone would come looking and find the mess left behind. So he ran most of the way, legs burning, lungs tight. When he reached the barn, the door was ajar. That wasn't right. He always left it pulled shut, tucked the latch quiet behind him. He froze for a second, heart hammering, then crept closer slow, like he'd learned to do in the woods when watching for rabbit tracks. The wind groaned against the rafters, but he heard it. Boots, heavy ones inside. Someone was in there. He crouched low behind the old wagon wheel, leaning against the side wall, listening. A man's voice, calm, deep, talking to the horses. The boy bit his lips so hard it bled. He waited and waited. When the man stepped out, he carried a pitchfork in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. His face was weathered, sun-creased beard gray in the chin, but still dark at the sides. He moved like a man who belonged to the land, slow but sure, eyes sharp. The boy didn't move, didn't breathe. The man didn't look his way, just walked toward the corral. And the boy took that chance, slipped in through the side door, grabbed what he could, some eggs, a bottle half filled with milk, and backed out just as fast. But this time he left tracks. Wet ones he didn't notice. He was already gone. By the time he got back to the cabin, just a shack really tucked between a boulder and a stand of birch. The littlest one was asleep again, curled beneath a blanket he'd made from an old horse cover. Mia sat with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the fireless hearth. He handed her the egg, cracked one into a dented pot, and stirred it over what embers were left. He lied and said they'd eat better tomorrow. He didn't say he'd been seen. Didn't say they had to be more careful now. He didn't have the words. But the next morning the barn was different. The door was open again, wide this time, and inside the feed drums had been moved closer, easier to reach. A crate of fresh wood sat near the wall, and someone had swept the floor already. He nearly turned back, but something made him go in anyway. He did the chores fast, barely breathing, and left with the flour sack heavier than usual. Inside it, someone had tucked a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. He stared at it like it might vanish. His hands trembled when he carried it home. He didn't tell the others. Not yet. The third day, he found a note tucked beneath a bowl of oats left in the milking stall, scrolled in a hand that wasn't neat but wasn't angry either. It said only, "You don't have to sneak, come knock." He burned the note in the fire that night, not because he was scared, but because something in it made him want to believe, and that was dangerous. He didn't go back the next morning. Couldn't. Fear sat too heavy in his chest. What if it was a trap? What if they were waiting with a rope or a sheriff? He couldn't risk it. Not with the girls depending on him. But hunger has a way of making cowards brave. That night when the wind picked up and the littlest started crying again, he pulled on his two small boots and walked back toward the barn with his breath coming short and sharp. There was a lantern burning by the door. He stood in the snow, heart hammering for what felt like hours. Then slowly he walked up the steps, raised a trembling fist, knocked. Footsteps inside, then silent. The door opened. A woman stood there, shawl around her shoulders, face pale from the cold, but not unkind. She looked down at him, said nothing. Behind her, the man appeared, arms crossed, one brow raised. "You're smaller than I thought," he said. The boy didn't answer. "I'm not mad," the man added. Still no answer. Then the woman stepped forward. "You've been feeding our animals," she said softly. "You've been taking care of what we didn't." The boy's lip quivered. He tried to say something, anything, but the lump in his throat was too big. "You're not in trouble," the woman said. "I didn't steal," he blurted. "I just needed." "We know," she said. Xylon stretched. Finally, the man spoke again. "You got a name, son?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Well," the man said, stepping aside. "Why don't you come in and tell us who you are?" The boy looked past him into the warm light of the barn, the smell of hay and oats and smoke. He looked back at the dark behind him where his sisters were waiting in the cold. He stepped inside. The warmth inside the barn hit him like a wave. It wasn't the fire. There wasn't one burning, but the stillness, the quiet order of the place. Everything had its place. Harnesses hung neatly from pegs along the wall. A saddle had been oiled recently, its leather gleaming faintly in the lantern light. The smell of animals was familiar, but it wasn't sharp or dirty like back at the shack where they'd stayed a winter ago. It was clean, warm, with straw and sweat and something else that made him feel small inside his bones. Safety. The man closed the door behind them. It creaked once and then thudded shut. Snow hissed against the outside walls, but in here, it felt like another world. The woman didn't speak right away. She crouched down slowly, knees crackling, and looked him in the eye. "You hungry?" she asked, voice low. He nodded. "I figured," she said. She stood and turned, walking through a smaller side door that led, he guessed, to the house. He didn't move, too scared to follow, but too frozen to run. The man didn't say anything either, just stood a few feet away watching. Not mean, not hard, just curious in a way that made the boy's skin itch. "You've been doing a good job," the man said finally. "The animals like you, that old goat out back, don't let just anyone milk her without a fuss." The boy swallowed hard, unsure if it was praise or a trap. "You've been doing chores, feeding Em right. I seen it. I seen your tracks too. First time I thought it was a drifter. Then I noticed things were cleaner. Tools put back right buckets where they belong. That don't sound like a thief. The boy shifted his weight, one boot scraping lightly on the packed dirt floor. I didn't take nothing we didn't need, he said. And only after I worked I wouldn't have if there was another way. The man nodded. I believe that. The door opened again, and the woman returned with a plate in her hands. It wasn't fancy, just bread beans and a bit of jerky, but to the boy it looked like a feast. She held it out and he took it with both hands, trying not to look too desperate as he sat on the edge of a feed bin and dug in. They didn't hover, which made it easier. They gave him space. Let him eat. Let him breathe. When he finished, the woman handed him a canteen and a rag to wipe his face. You got people? She asked after a long pause. He looked down. Two little sisters, he said. No one else. Where are they? He hesitated. Back in a cabin just off the south ridge near the birch line. How long have you been out there? The man asked. Since February, he said. Maybe longer. That made the woman Yui's. February in the mountains was no place for a grown man, let alone 3 children under 10. No, Mama. No, the boy said softly. The man didn't ask about the father. He could see it written on the boy's face. There wasn't one anymore. Whether he left, died, or disappeared, it didn't matter. The result was the same. You carrying that weight by yourself? The woman asked gently. The boy looked up at her, and for the first time she saw the tears burning at the edge of his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He just nodded. The woman stood, moving slowly as if afraid she'd spook him. We're going to the house, she said. You'll come with us, get warm, wash up. Then you can show us where your sisters are. They'll come too. The boy opened his mouth to argue, to say no, to say he didn't need help. But the words got tangled in the knot in his throat. And when the man reached out and placed a hand gently on his shoulder, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like permission. The snow had started again by the time they reached the cabin. The man who finally told the boy his name was Royce let him walk ahead to show the path, but he stayed close behind. The woman Clara brought a thick blanket tucked under one arm and a basket with more food. They didn't talk much on the way. Words weren't necessary. The boy's legs burned from walking the trail again so soon, but he pushed through it. He hadn't told them about the broken roof or the cold that seeped through the floorboards. He hadn't told them how the little one's cough sounded worse this morning, or how they were down to their last piece of hard bread. He didn't need to. Clara saw it all when she stepped inside the crooked door and took in the scene. Mia curled up beside the hearth, a doll with a missing butt, an eye clutched to her chest. The youngest lying listless face, flushed breath shallow. Clara didn't hesitate. She moved like she'd done this before. She checked the little one's pulse, her forehead, her lungs. Then she wrapped her up in the blanket and took her into her arms. We're going, she said to Royce, who didn't argue. By the time the sun dropped behind the trees, all 3 children were inside the farmhouse. The oldest boy, whose name Clara would later learn was Nate, sat in the corner of the parlor, freshly bathed and wrapped in a dry shirt 2 sizes too big. The girls had eaten and fallen asleep in a real bed. The littlest one, with a cloth soaked in vinegar, laid across her chest to ease the wheeze. Royce sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Clara stood nearby, her arms crossed tight, more from thought than cold. That boy, Royce said, he's got more grit than most men? Clara nodded slowly. He's got too much. No child should have to know how to ration oats and patch boots and carry babies through snow. Royce glanced over at her. You think we can do this? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on Nate, who had drifted to sleep, sitting up, head resting against the wall. We don't have much, she said finally, but we've got enough. Royce nodded. Then we do it. The first few days were quiet. Nate didn't talk much. The girls were more open, especially Mia, who followed Clara like a shadow and asked about every pot, spoon, and curtain in the house. The littlest began to recover slowly, her cough easing each day. Clara kept her close, sleeping in the same room just in case the fever returned. Nate worked every day without being asked, without hesitation. He rose early, helped Royce muck stalls, hauled buckets from the well-scrubbed floors, chopped wood. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't ask for praise. He did it because it made him feel less useless, less like a burden. But the nights were harder. He didn't sleep deep. Clara often heard him pacing the hallway or slipping outside to check on the barn. Once she found him curled on the porch steps in the dark, staring at nothing breath, puffing in the cold. She didn't speak, just sat beside him until he came back inside. One evening after supper, Royce laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't have to earn your place here, son." Nate looked up at him, eyes wide, lips parting, as if to ask how that could be. But the words never came. He just nodded and went back to drying dishes. 2 weeks passed. The thaw came slow, but it came. Streams broke open. The air turned soft. Life seeped back into the land. And then on a bright morning when the sun broke clean and strong over the eastern ridge, a man rode up the long road to the farmhouse. He wore a gray coat, the kind that came with lawmen or worse official business. His horse was lean, travel-worn. His face under the brim of his hat was pale and drawn. Royce met him at the gate, Clara at the porch. Nate was feeding the goats when he saw the rider and froze, pitchfork still in hand. The man dismounted, pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. "Looking for 3 children. Names match those you've taken in. Report filed in January. Abandoned. Thought dead." Clara Ara's face went still. "And who are you?" The man looked up, brother to their mother. Nate stepped back. The world tilted. He remembered him now. The man who showed up 1 week after the fire and refused to take them. Said he had his own family, his own troubles. "I've come to take them now." The man said, "Get things in order." "No," Nate said. It came out too fast, too loud. Royce looked at him, then stepped forward slowly. "You've got papers?" he asked. The man hesitated. "Working on it. I just need time." Royce shook his head. "You had time." Nate's chest heaved. His hands were clenched tight around the pitchfork now. Clara moved between him and the man without saying a word. "We'll let the courts sort it," the stranger said. Royce nodded once. "Then you'll get your chance, but until then, these kids stay here with us." The man looked like he might argue, but one look at Clara's eyes and he backed down, mounted, rode off without another word. Nate stood frozen breath, caught somewhere between fear and something else. "Hope." Clara turned to him. "You're not going anywhere," she said softly. "We're not letting you go." For the first time since the mountain snow fell, Nate let the tears come. Spring in the mountains came slow, almost reluctantly, like a wounded thing learning to walk again. The snow melted in ragged patches, revealing the dark, cold ground beneath, not green, yet but waiting patient. Creeks swelled and chattered louder than before, and trees shook off their white coats, one trembling branch at a time. The earth wasn't warm, not really, but it had stopped being cruel. Inside the farmhouse, a rhythm had started to take hold. Mornings were for chores and small lessons. Clara taught the girls how to thread a needle, how to scrub vegetables clean, how to lace their boots right and tight. Nate spent his mornings with Royce, learning the weight of tools he hadn't dared use before. There was something about the way Royce taught, not soft, not stern, just steady, like he trusted Nate could figure things out. And Nate, though he never said it, worked harder because of it. He didn't want to disappoint a man like that. Not now, not ever. But even as the farm settled into its new heartbeat, a quiet tension loomed just out of sight. The stranger who had come for them, mother's brother or not, hadn't vanished. Nate knew it. He saw the way Royce kept the rifle leaned by the door now, not locked away. He saw how Clara paused when the girls ran too far from the porch, calling them back, with a sharper edge in her voice than before. Nate didn't ask questions, but he watched. He always watched. One afternoon, as they mended a broken gate at the far end of the pasture, Royce looked at Nate without lifting his eyes from the hinge he was hammering. "You think he'll come back?" he asked. Jonah didn't answer right away. He was holding a post steady, the splinters digging into his palms. The breeze tugged gently at the collar of his too big shirt. "He didn't want us when Mama passed," Jonah said finally. "I remember that. He stood on the porch and said he didn't have room. Said we'd figure something out." Royce drove the nail in deeper. "What do you think changed?" Nate looked up, squinting toward the ridge. "I don't think anything did. I think he heard someone else might want us, and that made us worth something again." Royce didn't say anything to that. He didn't have to. That night when the fire was low and the house had gone still, Clara sat at the table stitching a button back onto one of Nate's shirts. The light from the lamp caught the wear on her fingers, small calluses, a nick healing at the knuckle. She wasn't a soft woman, not in the way folks in town sometimes expected, but she was gentle in her own quiet way. She looked up as Royce stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. "He sent word," Royce said. Clara didn't ask who she already knew. "What did it say?" "He's gone to the county judge. Says he's got blood claim, wants custody." Clara pressed her lips into a thin line. She finished the stitch, tied it off, and laid the shirt aside. "He has no interest in those children," she said quietly. "Not really. Not unless there's some coin in it." Royce nodded. "We'll have to go into town, speak for ourselves before he turns this into something it ain't." They sat in silence for a while. The wind tapped lightly at the window panes, a soft warning. Outside, the snow had finally given up the fight, but something colder had taken its place. Clara looked toward the hallway where the children slept. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They finally sleep through the night." Royce nodded again. "That's worth fighting for." The town was 2 days' ride. Royce hitched the wagon early and loaded it light, just enough for the trip and back, plus the girls bundled in extra blankets. Clara packed bread, cheese, and a tin of boiled eggs. Nate offered to ride behind on one of the horses, but Royce shook his head. "You ride up front with me," he said. "Ain't nothing you don't need to hear." The ride was long and cold, the sky heavy with the promise of more rain. The road was muddy in places, but the wheels held. The girls slept most of the way, lulled by the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Nate sat stiff beside Royce, clutching the edge of the seat, eyes locked on the horizon. He hadn't seen the town in months, not since before Mama got sick. Back then, he remembered the way people avoided them, the way whispers floated behind their backs. Widows' kids. No daddy, no money, just mouths to feed and shoes too thin for the frost. He'd never thought he'd return to that place again. But they didn't go to the square. Royce turned the wagon down a side road that led to a white building with narrow steps and a bell over the door. The courthouse. They tied up out front and walked inside, Clara holding the littlest, Nate holding his sister's hand tight. Royce walked ahead, shoulders square, jaw set like stone. The judge was a narrow man with glasses and a mouth that didn't smile. He sat behind a wide desk and leafed through papers like they were dry leaves. The other man was already there, seated with a lawyer beside him. He didn't look surprised to see them. Jonah stood behind Clara and Royce, his heart thudding so loud it nearly drowned out the words being said. Custody, kinship, provision, stability. The lawyer kept saying Nate's name like it belonged to a piece of land, not a boy. Then Clara spoke, quiet but fierce. "They're not just children to be claimed," she said. "They're people. They've lived in our home. They have food, warm beds. They laugh again. That man," she pointed without flinching, "he left them when it mattered most." The judge listened without expression. He scribbled notes, asked questions, but didn't tip his hand. The other man argued too, saying blood was blood and family law couldn't be thrown out just because someone had good intentions. It went on for hours. By the time they stepped outside, the sun was low and the wind bitter again. Clara wrapped the littlest tighter in her shawl. Royce said nothing, jaw tight. Nate followed, his heart raw. He had expected a fight, but not like this. Not so quiet, not so official. "They said they'll mail the decision," Royce told him later back at the wagon. "Might take a week," Clara added. Nate didn't ask what would happen if it went the wrong way. He already knew. The days that followed dragged like old mules through thick mud. Nate kept working. He fixed a fence post, helped Clara replant early beans, even stitched a tear in his own coat. The girls picked flowers and played in the yard, but their laughter came less often. They felt it too, the waiting. One evening, Clara found him sitting in the barn long after supper, his fingers stained with oil from greasing the latch on the big door. "You're worried," she said. He didn't deny it. "I keep thinking if I just do enough," he said, "they'll let me stay, that they'll see I can pull my weight, that I belong." Clara sat beside him on the hay bale. The light of the lantern cast their shadows high on the wall. "You belong here because you do," she said. "Not because of what you give. Not because of what we get, just because you do." Jonah nodded slowly, but the ache in his chest didn't leave. 2 more days passed. Then the letter came. Royce read it in the kitchen, his mouth a grim line as his eyes scanned the page. Clara stood behind him, the girls playing with scraps of cloth in the corner. Jonah waited near the door, fists clenched so tight his nails bit into his palms. Royce looked up and smiled. "It's done," he said. "They're staying." Nate didn't hear anything else. He sank to his knees, the air gone from his lungs, and Clara reached him first. She wrapped him up and held him close while the girls clung to his arms, confused but laughing. It was real. It was safe. It was over. Or so they thought. That night, just after the lamps were out and the house had gone dark, someone knocked on the door. Royce reached it, first rifle in hand. Clara stood behind him, holding the girls. Nate crouched by the fire, heart in his throat. When the door opened, the wind rushed in, but no one was there. Just a piece of paper nailed to the frame. 3 words. "This ain't over." The wind slammed the door shut the moment Royce yanked the note free. It snapped back into the frame like a warning shot, sharp, sudden, and final. The children flinched, and even Clara's voice caught slightly as she gathered them in closer, her hand instinctively reaching for the cross around her neck. Royce didn't speak. He just held the note out toward the firelight, letting the amber glow reveal each jagged letter carved into the paper with what looked like the edge of a blade. The strokes were deep, uneven, and angry. Someone didn't just write it, they meant it. "This ain't over." That was all it said, but it was enough. Nate didn't sleep that night. Neither did Royce. Both sat near the fire in silence. While the women and girls were tucked into the far bedroom, the door locked and a dresser pushed against it for good measure. Royce cleaned the rifle slowly, methodically, like it was the only thing in the world he trusted to speak on his behalf. Nate kept the smaller pistol in his lap, his hands cold but steady. It was an old thing, unreliable, heavy, but he'd practiced enough with Royce to know how to aim it, how to load it, how to hold it without shaking. The boy had changed. The barn boy who fed goats in muck stalls was gone, and what remained now was leaner, sharper, more still. He wasn't grown, not yet, but he was far from the child who first stepped into the kitchen with bare feet and a face too used to being told no. By sunrise, the decision had been made without a word spoken. They wouldn't wait to see what came next. They'd meet it head on. The next day was spent fortifying the homestead, not in a panicked way, but with a deliberate, measured sense of preparedness. Royce boarded up the side windows, installed a new lock on the barn doors, and set traps along the lower path that wound up the mountain. Clara moved the food stores to the root cellar and packed emergency bags with blankets and water, teaching the girls how to reach the hiding hole behind the wardrobe if they ever had to. Nate was tasked with watching the tree line and memorizing the sound of every bird, every rustle of wind. Nothing moved without him noticing. He sat up on the ridge after supper, legs tucked beneath him, hands resting on the loaded rifle that Royce had finally handed over without hesitation. Nate didn't speak about the note again. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wonder who left it. He already knew. It was the man, the one who claimed kin. He wasn't done. Clara tried to keep normally alive in the house. Meals still happened at the table. The girls still practiced their numbers. She still braided their hair and kissed their foreheads at night, but her eyes never strayed far from the door, and her ears caught even the softest groan of wood on the porch. Every knock sent a ripple through her spine. The family hadn't broken. They'd fused closer, but the threat hung in the air like thunder that never quite arrived. Then came the knock they weren't ready for. Late afternoon, 4 days after the note appeared, just as Clara was hanging linens on the back line, a group of riders crested the hill. Not one, not two, 5. Dust clouded behind them as they moved with purpose. Not town folk, not friendly. Clara dropped the basket and called for Royce, her voice sharper than a hawk's cry. He came out in seconds, rifle already in hand. Jonah was behind him, boots barely tied, hair wind blown from his perch in the loft. The riders didn't approach the porch. They stopped 50 yards out where the main fence line met the rise. One of them, a tall man with a red bandana tied around his arm, held up a piece of paper and waved it slowly. "A court order," he called out. "The boy belongs to family. We're here to collect." "Sturm." Royce stepped forward to the edge of the porch, barrel low but ready. "You tell your boss he's welcome to bring that paper himself. Until then, we're not handing over nothing." The man in the bandana chuckled. "He figured you'd say that." He didn't ride off. None of them did. They just sat there waiting, watching like wolves, too patient to lunge, but too close to forget. "They're not leaving," Clara said quietly that night, her voice barely audible beneath the hush of the fire. "They're making it clear. They'll starve us out or storm us, but they won't walk away." Royce didn't argue. Nate didn't blink. So they prepared for both. The next 2 days passed under siege, though no shots were fired. The riders took turns circling the ridge, camping just out of reach, watching with eyes that never softened. Royce and Nate took turns keeping guard, each learning the rhythm of the other's steps, each growing more silent by the hour. Clara kept the girls indoors reading stories by lamplight and humming hymns when the wind grew too loud. Then on the third night it began. It wasn't a full assault, not yet, just noise. A stone thrown against the window. A match struck in the dark. A voice hollering from the woods, slurred, taunting, promising. Nate didn't flinch. He was already by the front window, barrel pointed through the curtain. Royce was on the back porch, eyes narrowed against the black. They didn't shoot. Not yet. Not unless it was earned. But they knew it wouldn't be long. At sunrise, Royce came in from patrol with dirt smeared across his shirt and a cut just above his brow. They tried the traps, he said, tossing a bloodied boot onto the floor. One of M's stepped in, screamed like a pig. They pulled him out, but it spooked M. "I think they'll try again tonight." Nate was quiet as he stood near the basin, water still dripping from his fingers. Then he said, "Then we make it the last night." Royce met his eyes and nodded. "We do." That afternoon, Clara took the girls down into the root cellar and told them they were going to play a new game. It involved staying very quiet no matter what they heard above and not coming out until Clara said it was safe. She hugged them tight, whispered prayers against their hair, and kissed their faces like she was afraid to forget how they felt. Then she closed the door and climbed the stairs alone. Upstairs, Nate helped Royce move furniture, reinforcing the windows, scattering glass on the floor, near entryways, hiding lamps behind walls to reduce shadows. They turned the house into a fortress, not because they wanted to fight, but because they had no other choice. Dusk fell like a wolf shadow, silent and full of teeth. The first shot rang out just past midnight. It shattered the porch rail. Royce ducked and returned fire without hesitation, catching one of the riders in the leg as he tried to dart between trees. Nate was already at the back watching the barn. He spotted two shadows near the fence, one carrying a torch. He fired before thinking the shot clipping the torchbearer in the shoulder. The flame hit the ground, sputtered, and went out. They came in waves, then rushing the front door, trying the side windows, testing every weak point they'd spent days reinforcing. But the house held. Shot after shot echoed through the mountain night, the air thick with gunpowder and cold breath. Clara fired once, catching a rider in the thigh as he tried to climb the porch railing. He tumbled backward, groaning, and was dragged away by another shadow. Nate reloaded with shaking hands, eyes sharp, chest heaving. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a man, but he had something worth protecting, and it made him more dangerous than either. Royce took a hit in the arm near dawn. Clara bound it fast, using part of her apron as a bandage. The bleeding slowed, but his face was pale. Still, he refused to lie down. "I'm not leaving you two to finish it without me," he muttered. It was almost sunrise when the last of the riders fled, not because they were all down, but because they'd finally understood this wasn't a farm to be taken. It was a home being defended, and home, when it's fought for, becomes something holy. The quiet afterward felt too large, too empty. Clara emerged from the cellar with the girls, each of them blinking, like flowers pressed flat by snow now being allowed to bloom. Jonah stood on the porch watching the tree line, rifle lowered, but not put away. Royce sat on the steps, arm in a sling, face smudged with soot and dust. The yard was torn fences, splintered blood on the porch. A wheel knocked loose from the cart, but the house still stood. So did they. Later that morning, as they mended the door, Clara turned to Nate and brushed the dirt gently from his cheek. "You're not a guest here," she said softly. "You're not passing through." Nate looked up, eyes shining. He said nothing. He didn't have to. But just as the sun broke over the ridge, something caught his eye. Far down the mountain path, a man on a horse. Not one of the attackers, someone else. A suit, a paper in his hand. Another order, another threat, another chapter, not yet finished. The man in the suit didn't approach with the swagger of the hired guns that had come before. He didn't ride hard, didn't swing wide to display force. No, he rode in slow, like he had nothing to fear, nothing to hide. A single saddlebag, a paper rolled tight in his left hand, and a silver watch glinting in the morning sun were all he carried. Nate spotted him first, but he didn't raise the rifle. He didn't move at all. He simply watched, eyes narrowing, heart still unsettled from the night before. Royce came up behind him, cradling his arm in the sling Clara had made, and squinted at the rider coming up the hill. "Government," he said flatly. "Or thinks he is." Clara joined them a moment later, wiping her hands on the front of her skirt. Her mouth was a thin line, her eyes colder than morning frost. None of them said another word as the man dismounted and walked the last dozen steps to the porch. He removed his hat, a formal gesture, but one that felt empty under the circumstances. "I'm looking for a boy," he said, named Nate. Royce didn't answer. Neither did Clara. Nate took one slow breath and stepped forward. "I'm Nate," he said. The man gave him a quick once-over, clearly unimpressed, and then held up the roll document. "State order. You've been claimed by a blood relative, your uncle. He's filed for legal custody. I've been sent to escort you back to the city for placement." Royce's jaw clenched. That the same uncle who sent those men last night, who left a child in the mountains and came back only when he had something to gain. The man gave a small, tired smile. "Sir, I don't concern myself with family drama. I follow paperwork." Clara stepped in, then voice firm, calm. "He's not going with you." The man didn't flinch. He handed her the paper. "It's signed, stamped. Your feelings don't matter in the eyes of the law." Nate didn't look at the document. He didn't need to. He saw Clara's hands tremble slightly as she read. Royce leaned over her shoulder, muttering under his breath, "This is dated before the attack." Clara nodded. They were always planning to take him. The violence was just persuasion. The man in the suit waited. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look cruel either, just indifferent. And that's what made him more dangerous than any outlaw. A man who hurt with no emotion behind it, just duty. Nate stepped down off the porch. "No," the man frowned. "I'm sorry." "I said no," Nate repeated louder. "I ain't going." "That's not how this works. It is now." Clara reached for Nate, but he gently pulled away and walked toward the man until they stood just a few paces apart. "You have your paper," Nate said. "Go back and tell them I'm not their problem anymore." "You're a child," the man said flatly. "I was a child," Nate answered. "Now I'm something else." The man didn't argue, he didn't push. He only said, "There will be consequences," before turning and walking back to his horse. "We've survived worse," Clara said behind him, voice unshaking. The man mounted up, tipped his hat out of hollow politeness, and rode off without another word. Nate didn't watch him leave. He just turned and walked back toward the barn, toward the only real home he'd ever known. But Royce watched the man disappear down the ridge with a heavy heart because he knew something Nate didn't. When the law failed to break people with orders and threats, it often turned to something far colder. Time. They lived in a kind of fragile peace for the next few weeks. The attack stopped. The riders never returned, but the silence was thick and the air carried a weight they couldn't shake. Each sunrise brought a new tension. Would this be the day the law returned? Would it be men with guns again, or just one with a heavier piece of paper? Nate threw himself into work. He fixed fences, fed livestock, taught the girls how to pluck chickens and sharpen tools. Royce took him on long walks through the woods, teaching him how to move without being seen, how to listen for traps, how to survive when the world turns its back. Clara kept the girls busy with baking and sewing, teaching them the kind of quiet strength that didn't come with fists or fire, but lasted longer all the same. Nate didn't ask to sleep in the house again. He chose the barn even after the snow melted, even after Clara offered to fix up the spare room with clean sheets and quilts. He said he liked the sound of the animals. Truth was, he liked the distance. He liked watching from the edge. He wasn't afraid of being hurt. He was afraid of being needed, because the more he belonged, the more he had to lose. Then one morning, Royce didn't come in for breakfast. Clara found him out back, slumped against the well, blood soaked into his shirt. The wound in his arm had festered, gone dark beneath the sling. They got him inside, fever raging, skin burning to the touch. Clara did everything she could. Boiled water, wrapped herbs, prayed with hands clenched so tight her knuckles bled. But Royce was fading. Nate sat beside him that night, hands shaking for the first time in weeks. "You can't leave," he whispered. "Not now." Royce opened his eyes just barely. They weren't full of pain, just peace. "You're ready," he said. "I was only ever supposed to get you this far." Nate shook his head. That's not how this works. It is now. Royce smiled faintly, repeating the boy's words from before. Protect them. And then just like that, he was gone. The house didn't make a sound. Not a wail, not a scream. Clara held it all inside. Strong for the girls, strong for Nate. They buried him at the top of the ridge near the wildflowers that Royce used to point out when spring arrived. The girls cried. Clara cried too, but only once. Quietly with her hands pressed over her face in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. But Nate saw. He said nothing. He just picked up Royce's rifle and hung it on the wall over the fireplace. A week later, the letter came. Official seal delivered by a stage driver with a tired look and no idea what he was handing over. Clara opened it with trembling hands. Nate stood behind her, heart pounding. He already knew before the first line was read, before the signature was seen. He knew the state had approved the uncle's claim. Nate was to be taken within the month. A new family placement would be arranged. Failure to comply would result in arrest and forfeit of all property for obstruction. It didn't matter that Royce was gone. It didn't matter that this was the only home Nate had ever truly known. All that mattered to them was ink on a page. Clara sat down hard, the paper crumpling in her lap. The girls looked up from their sewing, eyes wide. I'm not going, Nate said. Clara didn't argue. She didn't say a word, but her hand reached out for his and he held it. That night, Nate packed a small bag. He wasn't leaving, but he was going to make sure they wouldn't come again. He didn't tell Clara. He only kissed the girls goodbye while they slept and stepped out into the cold morning before dawn. He knew where the uncle lived. Royce had told him once in passing, somewhere near the river towns, past the southern bend, a place where men dressed like merchants but carried weapons in their boots. Nate was going there not to beg, not to run, but to end it. He rode the old mule. It wasn't fast, but it was steady. He traveled light, just the rifle, some jerky, a small Bible Clara had left on the barn shelf years ago. The road was long and lonely, but Nate didn't mind. The longer it stretched, the more certain he became. This wasn't about papers. This was about a boy who had lost everything twice and wasn't going to let it happen a third time. It took 4 days to reach the town. By then, Nate had learned to sleep with one eye open, to eat only when the birds stopped singing. He found the uncle's house easy enough. Big place, too clean, too quiet. Nate walked right up to the front door and knocked. A servant answered. He looked Nate up and down, eyes full of judgment. Mr. Barrett, Nate asked. Wait here. Minutes passed. Then the man appeared. Tall, clean shave and soft hands. Not a farmer, not a worker, just a man who wore importance like perfume. You must be the nephew, he said, voice full of false cheer. Come to your senses then. Nate didn't speak. He reached into his bag and pulled out the rifle. The man paused it slightly. I'm not here to threaten, Nate said. I'm here to make a deal. A deal? You tear up the papers. You let me go. You tell them I died, ran off, anything. I won't come back. You won't hear from me, but you leave that family alone. The man laughed. That's not how this works. It is now, Nate said, eyes steady. There was a silence then, long and sharp. You're bluffing, the uncle said finally. Nate stepped closer. Try me. And for the first time, the man flinched. By nightfall, Nate was back on the road. Papers burned in a ditch behind him. He didn't look back. He returned just before dawn, boots thick with dust and eyes darker than they'd ever been. Clara was waiting at the edge of the barn, a lantern flickering in her hands. She didn't speak. She didn't ask where he'd gone. She only looked at him like a mother would a woman torn between pride and worry, between the instinct to hold and the strength to let stand alone. Nate stepped down from the mule, handed her the bag, and for a long moment they stood there in the quiet that comes after a storm. She didn't say it, but he could see it written across her face. You made it back alive. That was enough. The papers were gone. The threat was gone, but something had been taken from Nate in the process. Something he wasn't sure he'd ever get back. The boy who'd once fed goats in the barn under candlelight, who had slept curled up in the hay with his arms around frightened children. That boy had been hardened on the road. There was still kindness in him, yes, still a deep reservoir of love, but it had been coated now in armor, lined with a kind of resolve that only loss can forge. He didn't cry, not even when the girls came running out and wrapped their arms around his waist, babbling about how they'd missed him, how they thought he'd gone off for good. He smiled, ruffled their hair, and carried them one on each shoulder back toward the house. But inside, deep down, Nate knew something unspoken, that a piece of his innocence had been traded away, and the man who'd come back was no longer a child. Clara made breakfast that morning, real eggs, hot bread, and honey she'd been saving for weeks. They ate as a family, sunlight pouring through the windows, the air warm with the smell of food and quiet laughter. For a brief time they had peace again. The girls went back to their lessons. Clara took to the garden and Nate mended the fence posts out back. Each swing of the hammer echoed with something final, like closing a chapter they didn't yet know had ended. Weeks passed. The land greened with spring flowers blooming wild across the valley, bees humming through the orchard trees Royce had planted seasons before. Nate stopped sleeping in the barn. Clara insisted, and for once he didn't argue. She gave him Royce's room. He didn't touch anything on the shelves, just laid there at night, staring at the ceiling, breathing in the scent of old wood and earth, and listening for danger that no longer came. And then came the rains. It started with a light drizzle, nothing unusual, the kind that soaked the hills and brought out the frogs and worms. But by the third day, the clouds turned black. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, and the sky tore itself open. Trees bent sideways, chickens scattered the roof on the tools she'd peeled back like paper. Clara and the girls huddled inside. Nate and one of the older neighbor boys, a quiet teen named Marcus, went out to brace the livestock pen. That was the last time Nate saw the sun for 11 days. The river rose faster than anyone expected. A storm up north had collapsed a dam, and the water surged down through the valley like a beast unchained. Royce had once spoken of such floods years ago before Nate's time, but few believed another would come. Now the land itself seemed to scream under the weight of it. Trees were uprooted, boulders, carried like driftwood fences, shattered. On the 6th day, the first animal drowned. By the 8th half, the pasture was underwater. By the 9th, they were out of dry wood. The barn, which had once been a sanctuary, a cradle for survival, was the first to fall. Nate tried to save it, lashing the doors with rope, propping the beams, digging trenches to divert the water, but it was no use. He stood in the rain, soaked to the bone, watching the roof collapse in on itself like a dying thing. Clara found him hours later sitting on what used to be the loft ladder, eyes blank, knuckles white around a broken shovel handle. "We'll rebuild," she said. He didn't answer. She knelt beside him. "This place was never about wood and nails, Nate. It was about people, about us." Still he said nothing. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away and walked back into the storm. That night, the youngest girl, Piper, came down with a fever. Clara stayed up beside her, whispering prayers, soaking rags in cold water, whispering promises that everything would be all right. Nate sat at the top of the stairs, knees pulled to his chest, listening. Every time the child moaned, his stomach turned. Every time Clara sang, his throat tightened. He had seen men die. He had faced the weight of death more than once, but nothing chilled him like the sound of a child fading. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think, so he left again. He didn't tell anyone this time. He simply packed what was left, 2 blankets, the last of the medicine, a pouch of dried fruit, and rode east, toward the mountain trail Royce had once shown him. There beyond the ridge lived a woman who'd studied medicine in another life, a hermit by choice, a healer by legacy. He rode through the storm, through mud that pulled at the mule's legs like chains, through winds that screamed against the branches. He rode with eyes stinging and heart on fire. It took a full day and night, but he found her. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. One look at the boy soaked in shivering was enough. She packed a satchel of herbs, puces, bitter-tasting roots, and a small bottle of something so dark it looked like ink. "This will break the fever," she said, "but only if it's not too late." Nate nodded, took the satchel, and turned back into the storm. He arrived home just before dawn. Clara met him at the door, eyes red but hopeful. "She's still breathing," she whispered. Nate handed her the satchel. Clara didn't ask where it came from. She only whispered, "Thank you." He sat by the girl's bedside for the next day, refusing to sleep, refusing to move. When the fever broke that evening, he wept quietly, not from joy, but from the weight of it all, the burden of love, the terror of hope. Piper opened her eyes, smiled faintly. Nate held her hand and whispered, "We're going to be all right." Summer came. The river receded. The barn was gone, but they built a new one, smaller, simpler. The children helped. So did Marcus and his father. A neighbor brought a cow as a gift, and another brought seed. Clara baked bread and filled the air with music again. The mountains were still cold, but the fire inside the house never dimmed. Nate found peace in work. He rarely spoke of the past. He rarely smiled either, but when he did, it lit up the room. The children followed him like ducklings, mimicking his every move, his every quiet strength. Clara watched with eyes full of something deeper than pride, a love that had grown from ashes. One evening after supper, she sat on the porch beside him sipping tea. "You saved us," she said softly. Nate shook his head. "We saved each other." Clara turned to him, then truly turned. Her voice trembled. "Royce would be proud." Nate looked down at his hands. "I wish he could see." "He does," she said. They sat in silence. And then she asked something she never had before. "What do you want to be, Jonah?" He blinked, unsure. "I mean it," she said. "What do you want to do? Who do you want to become?" He thought long and hard. And then he said, "A man who doesn't leave." She reached for his hand. This time he didn't pull away. That night, under a sky full of stars, Nate stood in the doorway of the rebuilt barn and whispered a promise to the darkness. "I'm staying." And the wind, warm for once, carried that promise through the hills like a song. He didn't answer right away, just laced his fingers through hers and looked out over the barn, the fences, the home they'd built out of brokenness. "No," he said, "but that's what makes it grace." Time passed as it always does, and with it came change, slow and steady, like the turning of seasons that no man can stop. The children grew taller, louder, braver. One by one, they took on more responsibility, fixing the roof, tending the livestock, even running deliveries into town. The oldest boy, the same one who used to curl up beside Nate in the Hoft, began carving his own path, talking about building a house on the far side of the creek with lumber he'd mill himself. Clara cried when he said it, not because she was sad, but because it meant the roots they'd planted were taking hold. Clara and Nate never had children of their own. It wasn't for lack of trying, but the doctors in town kind, as they were gently explained that some wounds leave behind more than scars. At first, Clara grieved quietly the way she always did, sitting by the window, hands folded, watching the sky like it might give her an answer. But one evening, as Nate tucked the youngest to bed and listened to her whisper her prayers, Clara realized something. They didn't need more children. They had already been given a family stitched together by hardship, kindness, and a love that had never demanded blood to feel like home. Nate took to teaching the boys how to read maps and track deer, how to fix a broken wheel in the middle of nowhere, how to tell a good man from one who just says the right things. He kept the same knife Royce had given him in a drawer by the door and made sure the boys knew where it was, not because he feared violence, but because he believed in being prepared. He spoke of Royce often, never in hushed tones, but with reverence. He made sure the children knew that he had once been saved by a man who asked for nothing in return, and now he said it was their job to do the same. Clara spent her mornings in the garden, hands in the soil, humming songs her mother used to sing when she was a girl. She wrote letters to other women in the valley, widows, mothers, wives with nowhere to turn. She invited them to the farm, taught them how to bake, how to can vegetables, how to heal. The kitchen became a place of laughter and stories, the kind passed from hand to hand like fresh bread. But even in peace, the world didn't forget them. One fall, a man arrived at the farm asking questions. Said he was looking for a boy who once lived in the mountains, one who might have been part of a robbery gone wrong. Nate stepped forward before any of the children could answer, his voice calm but firm. He told the man he didn't know anything about that the only people who lived here were his family. The man narrowed his eyes, nodded once, and left without another word. That night, Nate sat on the porch until dawn, rifle across his lap. The past had come knocking again, and while it hadn't gotten through this time, it reminded him that peace was something you had to protect. When Jonah passed many winters later, they buried him beside her under the cottonwood, where the wind still told stories and the children still played. And for generations, they remembered the boy who fed animals alone in a barn, and the woman who came looking for a ghost only to find a son, a partner, and a future. They remembered the ones who built a family where none should have grown, and they said the valley was never the same after them. Because sometimes the mountains echo not just with thunder, but with love that refuses to fade.